The afternoon sun beat down on the busy streets of Montgomery. It was December 1, 1955, a Thursday that seemed like any other. The air was crisp with winter chill, but not unbearably cold. People hustled about, finishing their workday, thinking of home and dinner. Among them was a woman in her early 40s, tired after a long day at the department store where she worked as a seamstress. Her fingers were slightly sore from hours of detailed stitching. She had been on her feet most of the day, and all she wanted now was to get home to her husband. The Cleveland Avenue bus pulled up to the stop. She climbed aboard, paid her fare, and found a seat in the middle section, not the front, which was reserved for white passengers only, but not quite the back either. She settled in, clutching her purse on her lap, and gazed out the window as the bus rumbled along its familiar route. The woman wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't planning to make history. She was simply a hard-working person who wanted to rest her tired feet on her way home. As the bus continued its journey, more passengers got on at each stop. Soon, all the seats in the white section were filled. The bus driver, a man known for his strict enforcement of the segregation rules, looked in his rearview mirror and noticed a white man standing in the aisle. The driver stopped the bus. He turned around and called out to the black passengers seated in the middle section. "You'll better make room for white folks to sit down," he ordered, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet bus. 3 black passengers reluctantly stood up and moved toward the back of the bus, but the woman remained seated, looking straight ahead. The driver noticed her stillness amid the movement. He frowned and walked down the aisle, stopping right beside her seat. Passengers held their breath. This kind of confrontation never ended well for black folks. "I said, move to the back," he demanded, staring down at her. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and dignified. There was no anger in them, but there was something else. A quiet determination that caught the driver off guard. "No," she said simply. The driver's face reddened. "You know I can have you arrested for this," he threatened. "You can do what you must," she replied calmly. Whispers rippled through the bus. A young mother pulled her child closer. An elderly man shook his head slightly, perhaps in warning, perhaps in admiration. Everyone knew the rules. Breaking them meant trouble. The driver, now visibly angry, stormed back to the front of the bus. He pulled over at the next corner and picked up the radio receiver. "I've got a colored woman refusing to give up her seat," he reported. "Send someone to handle it." While they waited for the police, the bus fell into an uneasy silence. Some white passengers looked annoyed at the delay. Others stayed out the windows, pretending not to notice what was happening. The black passengers kept their eyes down, but many of them stole glances at the woman who dared to stay seated. The woman herself sat still, her posture straight but not tense. She didn't look frightened, though she must have known what was coming. There was something about her quietness that commanded respect, a dignity that even the angry driver couldn't diminish. Minutes ticked by. Then blue lights flashed outside as a police car pulled up alongside the bus. 2 officers climbed aboard, their heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. They approached the woman, towering over her small frame. "What's the problem here?" one of them asked, though everyone knew exactly what the problem was. "She won't move to the back where she belongs," the driver explained, pointing accusingly. The officers turned to the woman. "Stand up," one ordered. Slowly, with deliberate movements, she gathered her purse and stood. But there was nothing submissive in the way she rose. She wasn't surrendering, she was making a choice. As the officers escorted her off the bus, she walked with her head held high. Not a single word of protest left her lips, but her silence spoke volumes. No one on that bus could have possibly imagined what this simple act of defiance would set in motion, or how it would change a nation forever. The police officers led the woman off the bus and into the late afternoon air. Their hands firmly gripped her arms, but they didn't need to drag her. She walked with purpose, each step measured and dignified despite the circumstances. Behind them, curious faces pressed against the bus windows. Some passengers looked relieved that the disruption was over, while others seemed troubled by what they had just witnessed. The bus driver stood with his arms crossed, watching with a smug expression that said he'd won this round. "You know what you did was against the law, right?" one officer asked as they approached the police car. "Is it a law that makes any sense?" She replied softly, not raising her voice but not backing down either. Her question hung in the air between them. The second officer opened the back door of the patrol car. "That's not for you to decide, ma'am." She looked him straight in the eye. "If not us, then who?" The officer had no answer for that. They weren't used to people talking back, especially not with such calm conviction. Most folks they arrested were either angry and shouting or scared into silence. This quiet confidence was something else entirely. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the time the police car arrived at the station, a small crowd had already gathered outside. News traveled fast in the community. Everyone knew everyone, and injustice against one felt like injustice against all. Inside the station, the woman sat on a hard wooden bench waiting to be processed. The room smelled of floor polish and cigarette smoke. Officers moved around her, some ignoring her presence, others stealing curious glances. They weren't accustomed to having someone so composed in their holding area. A desk sergeant approached with a clipboard. "Name and address," he demanded without looking up. She provided the information clearly, her voice never wavering. As he wrote, she noticed his hand pause briefly. Perhaps he recognized her name, or perhaps he was just surprised by her manner. "Phone call?" he asked, finally meeting her eyes. She nodded and was led to a wall-mounted telephone. Her fingers, the same ones that had spent hours meticulously sewing that day, now dialed numbers she knew by heart. Her husband answered on the third ring. "They've arrested me," she said simply. A pause on the other end. Then, "I'm coming right away." While she waited, a young officer brought her a paper cup of water. He set it down without a word, but there was something in his eyes, not quite sympathy, but recognition of her humanity at least. "Thank you," she said. He nodded slightly before walking away. Outside the station, the crowd had grown larger. People from all over town were showing up, shopkeepers closing early, church members still in their work clothes, students who should have been at home doing homework. They stood in hushed groups, occasionally glancing at the station doors, waiting. News of the arrest reached a local community leader at his small law office across town. He immediately recognized the importance of what had happened. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the moment they had been waiting for. He picked up his telephone and began making calls. First to the young minister who had recently moved to town, then to other community leaders, each one agreeing. This was the time to act. Back at the station, the woman's husband arrived, worry etched across his face. He spoke briefly with the desk sergeant, then was allowed to see his wife. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "I'm fine," she assured him, though they both knew fine was a relative term. "I didn't plan this, you know." "I know," he said, "but maybe it was meant to happen anyway." The booking process continued, fingerprints pressed onto cards. A photograph taken while standing against a height chart, paperwork filled out in triplicate. Through it all, she maintained her composure, refusing to let them see any fear. As evening fell, she was allowed to leave with her husband after posting bail. They stepped outside to find the crowd had grown even larger. People parted silently to let them through, many reaching out to touch her arm or shoulder in silent support. An older woman pressed a handkerchief into her palm and whispered, "We're with you." The woman looked around at the faces, some she knew, many she didn't. All of them were there because of what had happened on that bus. All of them understood that something important had begun. As she and her husband walked home through the gathering darkness, neither of them spoke much. They'd both sensed that their lives had just changed forever, that the simple act of staying seated had set something enormous into motion. What they couldn't possibly know was just how far those ripples would spread, or how they would grow into waves powerful enough to change an entire nation. The telephone rang well into the night. News of what had happened on the Cleveland Avenue bus spread from house to house, church to church. By morning, the woman's small living room was filled with visitors, community leaders, church folks, and neighbors who came to show support. "This isn't just about you anymore," said an older gentleman who had been fighting for equal rights for decades. His voice carried the weight of experience, of battles won and lost. "This could be the case we've been waiting for." The woman sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't slept much. The events of yesterday kept playing in her mind, the driver's angry face, the silence on the bus, the cold metal of handcuffs against her wrists. "I didn't do it to start trouble," she said softly. "I was just tired." A younger man, a minister new to town with a powerful speaking voice, leaned forward in his chair. "Tired of giving in," he said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "Yes, tired of giving in." That simple phrase seemed to capture what everyone in the room was feeling. They were all tired. Tired of moving to the back, tired of drinking from separate water fountains, tired of being treated as less than human in their own hometown. The minister stood up and paced the small room. "What if we don't ride the buses?" he suggested. "Not just today or tomorrow, but until something changes." The room fell silent as people considered this idea. A bus boycott would be difficult. Most black workers in town relied on buses to get to their jobs. Walking would mean miles in all kinds of weather. Carpools would need to be arranged. It would require sacrifice from thousands of people. "Do you think folks will actually do it?" someone asked doubtfully. The woman's husband spoke up. "If they understand what's at stake, they might." Plans came together quickly. Phone calls were made. Flyers were printed. Church basements became command centers. The trial was set for Monday. That would be the first day of the boycott. Sunday arrived, and churches across town buzzed with energy. Preachers spoke passionately about dignity and justice. The woman's name was on everyone's lips, her quiet courage and inspiration. "Tomorrow, we walk," one preacher told his congregation. "We walk for ourselves, for our children, and for everyone who's ever been told to move to the back." The church erupted in agreement, hands raised, voices calling out, "Yes," and "Amen." After service, people gathered in small groups to plan how they would get to work without the buses. Those with cars volunteered to drive others. Some employers, sympathetic to the cause, offered to adjust work schedules. Taxi drivers from the black community agreed to charge the same fare as the bus, 10 cents, instead of their usual rates. That evening, the woman sat by her window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow, she would face a judge and possibly jail time. She felt the weight of expectation on her shoulders, but also something else, a sense that perhaps her simple act of refusal had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. Her husband brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought for a moment, not scared exactly. More, wondering where all this will lead. "Wherever it leads," he said, taking her hand, "you won't be walking alone." Morning came with a chill in the air. The woman dressed carefully for court in her best dress, her husband helping with the buttons at the back. They ate breakfast in silence, the ticking of the kitchen clock marking the minutes until they needed to leave. Outside, the streets were unusually quiet. No rumble of bus engines, no squeal of brakes at the corner stop. Instead, people were walking, men in work clothes, women in uniforms, students with books tucked under their arms. They walked with purpose, heads held high. As the woman and her husband made their way to the courthouse, others joined them, not speaking, just walking alongside in silent support. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, hundreds had gathered. The crowd parted to let them through. Hands reached out to touch her shoulders, her arms, brief contacts that said more than words could. "We're with you," those touches said. "You're not alone." Inside the courtroom, the woman stood tall as the charges were read. The judge looked out at the packed room, surprised by the turnout for what should have been a routine case about city transportation rules. What he didn't know, what none of the city officials knew yet, was that outside, the buses were running nearly empty. All across town, bus drivers were completing their routes with no one to pick up, no fares to collect. The boycott had begun, and it was about to change everything. The courthouse steps were crowded that Monday morning. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the December chill, their breath forming small clouds in the air. They weren't there to attend their own cases or serve as witnesses. They had come to show support for the woman who had refused to give up her seat. Inside, the trial was brief. The judge seemed eager to move things along, perhaps uncomfortable with the unusual amount of attention this simple case was receiving. The woman was found guilty of violating the city's segregation laws and fined $10 plus $4 in court costs. Her lawyer, a sharp-minded man who had been fighting these battles for years, immediately announced they would appeal the decision. This wasn't just about one woman on one bus anymore, it was about challenging the very laws that kept people separated. But what happened outside the courthouse that day was even more significant than what happened inside. All across town, Buses rolled along their usual routes almost completely empty. Drivers called in to report the strange situation, no black passengers anywhere. At the bus company office, managers gathered around a large table covered with route maps and schedules. Their faces grew increasingly worried as reports came in. By midday, it was clear this wasn't a coincidence or a temporary situation. This was organized. "They can't keep this up," one manager said confidently. "They need us more than we need them." A younger manager wasn't so sure. "I don't know," he said, looking out the window at people walking determinedly along the sidewalks. "They seem pretty committed to me." That evening, while buses sat nearly empty in the depot, thousands of people packed into a local church. The building was so full that people stood in the aisles, sat on windowsills, and gathered outside to listen through open doors and windows. The young minister who had suggested the boycott stood before them. Though only in his 20s, his voice carried the power and conviction of someone twice his age. "Today, we have started something that cannot be stopped," he told the crowd. "We do not fight with fists or guns or hatred. We fight with the weapon of love and the ammunition of unity." The church rocked with cheers and amens. People who had walked miles that day, whose feet ached and whose bodies were tired, found new energy in his words. "How many of you will continue tomorrow?" he asked. "And the next day? And as long as it takes?" Hands shot up throughout the church. People rose to their feet, clapping and shouting their commitment. The woman who had started it all sat quietly in the front row, amazed at what her simple act of defiance had sparked. After the meeting, a committee was formed to organize transportation alternatives. People with cars signed up for a carpool system. Meeting points were established throughout the city where workers could gather to catch rides. Black taxi drivers continued to offer reduced fares. Word of the boycott began to spread beyond the city limits. Newspapers in nearby towns picked up the story. A reporter from a northern paper arrived to cover what was happening. "How long do you think this can last?" he asked one of the organizers. "As long as it needs to," came the reply. Days turned into weeks. The bus company's financial losses mounted. Some white business owners began to worry. Their black customers were no longer coming downtown to shop because they had no way to get there. City officials, who had initially dismissed the boycott as a passing nuisance, now held emergency meetings. They tried various tactics to break the movement, pressuring insurance companies to cancel policies for the carpool drivers, arresting people for minor traffic violations, even spreading rumors to create division among the boycott leaders. But none of it worked. Instead of weakening, the boycott grew stronger. People who had never been involved in civil rights activities before found themselves drawn into this peaceful revolution. Winter deepened. People walked through rain and cold, sometimes for miles each way. Shoes wore out, bodies tired. But spirits remained strong. One evening, after a particularly cold day, an elderly woman limped into a community center where boycott leaders were meeting. Her shoes were worn through, her feet blistered from walking. A young volunteer rushed to help her to a chair. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be walking in your condition," he said gently. The woman looked up at him, her eyes bright with determination. "My feet are tired," she said, "but my soul is rested. I'll walk as long as it takes." Her words spread through the community, becoming a kind of motto for the movement. Tired feet, rested souls. It captured perfectly what they were all feeling. The physical hardship paired with spiritual strength. And so the buses continued to roll, empty and unused, while a community discovered its power to change the world by simply withholding its participation from an unjust system. As January turned to February, the boycott entered its third month. What many had dismissed as a passing protest had become a way of life. The woman who had refused to give up her seat now rarely left her house alone. After losing her job at the department store, she spent her days answering phone calls and letters from supporters and helping with the endless work of organizing the boycott. Late one night, while the neighborhood slept, a brick came crashing through her front window. Glass scattered across the living room floor. Her husband rushed to check outside, but whoever had thrown it was already gone. They swept up the glass in silence, both understanding what it meant. The other side was getting desperate. They weren't the only targets. The young minister who had become the voice of the movement answered his phone one evening to hear a man's voice promising to burn his house down if the boycott didn't end. He hung up and turned to his wife, who had heard every word. "We knew this might happen," she said quietly, cradling their infant daughter. He nodded. "I won't blame anyone who decides it's too dangerous to continue." But the next day, at a meeting of boycott leaders, not a single person suggested giving up. Meanwhile, the city's white leadership was feeling the pressure. The empty buses were costing the company thousands of dollars each week. Downtown businesses reported sales dropping as black customers stopped coming to shop. Something had to give. The mayor called a meeting with several moderate white business leaders and a few carefully selected black ministers, none of whom were involved in leading the boycott. "We're willing to make some concessions," the mayor said. "More courteous treatment, maybe a few more stops in colored neighborhoods." Word of this offer reached the real boycott leaders quickly. They met in the back room of a friendly barbershop to discuss it. "They're trying to divide us," said one elderly deacon, "offering crumbs when we're asking for the whole loaf." The woman who had started it all spoke up. "This isn't about better treatment under segregation. It's about ending segregation." They voted unanimously to reject the mayor's offer. The city's response was swift and harsh. Police began ticketing carpool drivers for minor violations. The young minister was arrested for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Tax investigations were suddenly opened against boycott supporters who owned businesses. Then came the biggest blow. On a cold February morning, nearly 90 people, including most of the boycott leaders, were indicted by a grand jury. The charge: conspiracy to interfere with the business. News of the indictments spread through the community like wildfire. People gathered in homes and churches to discuss what it meant. Some were afraid, others were angry. Most were simply more determined than ever. The day after the indictments, an older man walked 8 miles to his job as a governor. His employer, a white woman who had privately supported the boycott, offered him a ride home. "Aren't you getting tired of all this walking?" she asked as they drove. The man looked out the window at the empty buses passing by. "Every day," he admitted. "But you know what keeps me going? My grandchildren. I'm doing this so they won't have to." The mass arrests began early on a rainy morning. Police cars moved through the neighborhoods, picking up those who had been indicted. By noon, the jail was overflowing with boycott supporters, many still in their work clothes or house dresses. Photographers from national newspapers were there to capture the scene. For the first time, people across the country saw images of ordinary citizens, teachers, preachers, housewives, laborers, being fingerprinted and processed like criminals, all for the crime of refusing to ride segregated buses. The young minister was the last to turn himself in. The jailhouse was packed beyond capacity. People shared cells meant for half their number. There weren't enough beds, so many sat on the floor. But instead of complaints, the sound of singing filled the corridors. Old spirituals that had sustained their ancestors through slavery and its aftermath now strengthened a new generation fighting for dignity. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round," they sang. "I'm gonna keep on walkin', keep on talkin', marchin' up to freedom land." Guards tried to quiet them, but the singing only grew louder. It spilled out through bad windows to the crowds gathered outside. Those outside picked up the songs, their voices joining with those inside until it seemed the whole city could hear them. That night, as the woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus lay on a thin jail mattress, she didn't regret a thing. What had begun as a simple act of personal dignity had grown into something much bigger than herself. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. Spring came to Montgomery, bringing warmer days but no end to the boycott. The bus company was barely hanging on. Routes had been cut, drivers laid off. The empty buses that still ran seemed like ghosts haunting the city streets, reminders of a system that people had simply refused to accept any longer. The boycott had now lasted over 5 months. 5 months of walking. 5 months of carpools. 5 months of unity that no one, not the mayor, the police chief, or the business leaders, had believed possible. While the community held strong on the streets, a different kind of battle was taking place in the courtroom. The woman's lawyer had not been content with just appealing her conviction. He had taken the bold step of filing a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of bus segregation itself. The case wasn't just about one woman anymore. To strengthen it, they had added 4 other plaintiffs, people who had also experienced discrimination on the buses. Together, they were asking the court to declare what everyone already knew in their hearts, that separating people based on the color of their skin was simply wrong. On a warm May morning, the federal courthouse was packed. People had lined up before dawn to get seats. Those who couldn't fit inside waited patiently on the steps and sidewalk, eager for any news. Inside, the woman sat with the other plaintiffs at a long wooden table. Across the aisle, city lawyers shuffled papers and whispered to each other. At the front of the room, 3 federal judges prepared to hear the case. The lead plaintiff's lawyer rose to speak. Though he'd faced many hostile courtrooms before, he stood tall, his voice steady and clear. Your Honors, we are here today because the 14th Amendment to our Constitution promises equal protection under the law to all citizens. Yet in Montgomery, and throughout much of our nation, that promise remains unfulfilled. He went on to explain how segregation laws harmed not just individuals, but the very fabric of American democracy. As he spoke, even some white observers found themselves nodding in agreement. The city's lawyers countered with arguments about states' rights and separate but equal, the same phrases that had been used to justify segregation for decades. But somehow, in this courtroom, on this day, those old arguments sounded hollow. One of the judges leaned forward. Can you explain how having citizens of different races sit in different sections of the same bus provides equal treatment under the law? The city lawyer stumbled over his words. He couldn't answer because there was no answer, at least not one that made any sense. The hearing lasted all day. Witnesses were called, questioned, and cross-examined. Bus drivers testified about how they enforced the rules. City officials tried to defend the system. But the most powerful testimony came from ordinary citizens who described the daily humiliation of being forced to the back of the bus or having to stand even when seats were available in the white section. As the woman testified about what had happened that December day, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke without anger, without bitterness, just the simple truth of her experience. When she finished, you could have heard a pin drop. I was tired, she said, looking directly at the judges. Not just physically tired after a long day of work. I was tired of giving in. Outside the courthouse, as the sun began to set, people waited for news. They had brought folding chairs and picnic blankets. Children played tag between the adults. Someone started singing, and others joined in. The young minister moved through the crowd, stopping to chat, offering encouragement. Despite the pressure he'd been under, the death threats, the arrest, the constant demands on his time, he remained calm and focused. What do you think will happen? A young woman asked him. I don't know what the judges will decide, he answered honestly. But I know that we've already won something important. We've proved that we can stand together. That's a victory they can't take away from us. Back in the neighborhoods, the boycott continued. People who had never imagined themselves as activists had found their voices and their courage. Housewives who used to mind their own business now organized carpools. Laborers who had kept their heads down now spoke up at community meetings. Teenagers who had been taught to stay out of trouble now proudly wore homemade boycott badges. An elderly man who could barely walk anymore sat in a rocking chair on his porch every morning, offering cups of water to those walking to work. A schoolteacher used her lunch break to pick up hospital workers for their afternoon shifts. A group of college students created a newsletter to keep everyone informed about boycott news. Late one evening, the young minister received a phone call from a reporter asking for his reaction to the court's decision. He held his breath. He hadn't heard anything yet. What decision? He asked. They haven't announced it officially, the reporter said, but I have a source inside. The 3-judge panel is going to rule in your favor. They're striking down bus segregation as unconstitutional. The minister gripped the phone tightly, afraid to believe what he was hearing. Could it really be true? After all these months of struggle, had they actually won? The reporter was still talking. The city will appeal, of course. It'll go to the Supreme Court. But my legal sources said you've got a solid case. After hanging up, the minister sat alone in his study for a long time. They had dared to hope, but now that hope might actually be turning into reality. There would be more battles ahead. The Supreme Court, the city's resistance, the long process of changing hearts and minds. But in this moment, he allowed himself to feel something that had been in short supply lately: joy. The The summer heat beat down on Montgomery as the boycott passed its 8th month. The city had appealed the federal court ruling, sending the case to the highest court in the land. Now everyone waited, continuing their daily routine of walking, carpooling, and standing firm. On a particularly hot afternoon, the woman whose refusal had started it all sat on her porch, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. Her husband had set up a small wading pool for neighborhood children to splash in. Their laughter filled the air, a reminder of why this fight mattered so much. A car pulled up, and the young minister stepped out, wiping sweat from his brow. His face told her the news before he even spoke. "The Supreme Court has agreed to hear our case," he said, climbing the porch steps. "But they won't get to it until fall. More waiting, more walking, more pressure from those who wanted things to go back to the way they were." "Can folks hold out that long?" she asked quietly. The minister looked at the children playing in the water. "We've come this far," he said. "We'll make it the rest of the way." As summer turned to fall, life in Montgomery had taken on a new rhythm. The sight of empty buses had become normal. So had the early morning carpools, the worn-out shoes, and the community spirit that held everything together. The boycott had now lasted over 300 days, almost a full year of refusing to ride. Children who had watched their parents walk to work day after day now understood what it meant to stand up for something important, even when it was difficult. On a crisp November morning, news came that the Supreme Court had reached a decision. People gathered around radios in barbershops, kitchens, and church offices, waiting to hear their fate. The announcement was brief but clear. The Supreme Court had upheld the lower court's ruling. Bus segregation was unconstitutional, not just in Montgomery, but everywhere. A moment of stunned silence was followed by cheers, tears, and prayers of thanks. Phone lines lit up across town as people called friends and family to share the news. Church bells rang out. In some neighborhoods, people poured into the streets in spontaneous celebration. The woman who had refused to give up her seat sat quietly in her living room, holding her husband's hand as they listened to the news on their small radio. After all this time, after all the hardship, they had actually won. "Are you happy?" her husband asked. She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said finally, "but there's still so much more to be done." The city officials weren't quick to accept defeat. They tried to find loopholes to delay implementing the court's order. But the law was clear, and eventually they had to comply. On a December morning, almost exactly 1 year after the woman had been arrested, the boycott leaders gathered for an important meeting. The time had come to decide whether to end the boycott. The discussion was surprisingly heated. Some felt they should continue until every demand had been met. Others argued that with the Supreme Court victory, their main goal had been achieved. The young minister spoke last. "We started this boycott to fight an unjust law, and that law has now been struck down. We've shown what's possible when we stand together. If we continue now, it might seem like we're unwilling to accept victory. I think it's time to ride the buses again, as equals." After much debate, they voted to end the boycott. But first, they established rules for returning to the buses. Sit from the back forward, but take any open seat. Be dignified, no gloating. Respond to violence with peaceful resistance. The night before the boycott officially ended, thousands gathered for one final mass meeting. The church was filled beyond capacity, with people spilling out into the yard and street. The young minister addressed the crowd. "Tomorrow, we return to the buses with simple dignity and quiet pride. What began as a protest has become a movement. What started with one woman's courage has grown into a community's victory." The woman herself received a standing ovation when she entered. As the applause finally quieted, she spoke briefly. "This isn't my victory," she said, her voice strong despite her small frame. "This belongs to all of us who walked, who drove, who sacrificed. And most of all, to the children who will never know what it means to be told they must sit in the back." Early the next morning, people gathered at bus stops across the city. Some were nervous, others excited. Many had not been on a bus in 381 days. The first bus arrived at a stop where a small group waited. The driver, a different man than the one who had started all this a year ago, opened the door. He nodded politely as people boarded, paying their fares. An elderly man who had walked miles every day during the boycott was the first to sit down in the front seat. No one challenged him. A young mother with her child took a seat in the middle section. Everyone found places scattered throughout the bus, black and white passengers sharing the same space for the first time. As the bus pulled away from the curb, a small but important barrier in American life had fallen. There would be many more battles ahead in the struggle for equal rights, in schools, at lunch counters, at voting booths, and beyond. But in this moment on this bus, something had changed forever. The woman who had refused to give up her seat didn't ride that first day. She stayed home, giving others the chance to experience this new beginning. Her role in history was already set, not as someone who had sought fame or attention, but as an ordinary person whose extraordinary courage had helped change a nation.